What's up, everybody? Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 83, and I'm the co-host Kyle Anslone. Just like every Monday, I'm joined by the co-host Will Porter. Will, how you doing, buddy?
I'm doing just fine, man. Just hanging out on Sunday. How you doing?
Pretty good. We got a blizzard here, a couple feet of snow already. I hate it. My dog loves it, so that's kind of been my battle today, trying not to get him to spend all day in the snow. But we got a bunch of news to talk about today. Stuff on Afghanistan, cops, Yemen. CNN did a pretty interesting report on Yemen. Here's talk about it all over the internet, YouTube, Library, Odyssey for video versions. It's hosted at the Libertarian Institute, where I'm the news editor. You can also find my news roundup there. And then you can also find the show through any of our social media. We post clips from the show on Twitter, Facebook, and MeWe. The MeWe channel is really picking up, so find a place to support the show and make sure you share it with your circle and network. And the last thing I have before we get rolling here is the sponsor of the show is Paloma Verde. Paloma Verde sells great CBD products. If you're already a CBD user, you know how it benefits you. Check out their deals and their products. They're all lab tested, so they're absolutely fantastic. They're going to work the same way for you every time. You could use the Edstrats. Will, you like the Edstrats with melatonin, helps to battle insomnia. I
Yeah.
like the different topicals they have, CBD infused lotions and creams. Put them on somewhere where you're having a little bit of pain, and it really helps to take that away. So PalomaVerdeStore.com, and then be sure to use the promo code PEACE, PEACE, when you check out. You'll get 25% off at checkout. Will, let's get into the news today. We have probably a week ago, right? The U.S. put out this story that they're proposing an interim government to run Afghanistan until a new election is held. And this is, I guess, their attempt in the Biden administration to save the Trump deal or find some way around pulling out troops. So what do you think about this U.S. proposed deal, and what are some of the details here?
Yeah, this is pretty interesting, because like there's been some uncertainty about what Biden plans to do about Afghanistan. Like Trump, signed a deal with the Taliban last year to have all U.S. forces out of the country by May, which is, coming up pretty soon here, less than 2 months from now. And Biden's kind of been signaling that he might not do that he's going to postpone it or possibly not withdraw at all. But now, as you said, they've rolled out what they're calling a peace plan that seems to suggest continued involvement in the country well beyond the May deadline. Even though we have heard the Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, he does keep saying that withdrawal is still on the table. But it's not really clear they're committed to doing that. And I think they're kind of formulating still what they want to do with this plan. But we did get a draft proposal leaked last week in actually Afghan media at Tolo News that showed some of what they're thinking about here. And so when Trump inked the deal with the Taliban last February, the idea was that the Taliban and the Afghan government would, hold some kind of peace talks and work out a bunch of issues, prisoner swaps, a ceasefire, that kind of stuff, work that out on their own. And, those talks did begin last September in Qatar, but they've kind of stalled since. Like they haven't made a lot of progress. I think they agreed on sort of a framework for negotiating, but I don't think they got to any actual substantial negotiations yet. So what it seems Biden is now stepping in here to have the U.S. preside over this intra-Afghan peace process. That's what they're proposing in this draft proposal thing. And they've given themselves a very tall order. They've got a bunch of stuff that they're trying to do. They're talking about arranging a ceasefire. They're talking about a whole new Afghan constitution, or at least some seriously amended constitution. Setting up some kind of interim government contraption that until they can hold new elections. And maybe most controversial of all, they're talking about power sharing with the Taliban within the government. So they're giving themselves a whole lot of tasks here and a very big job to do. And they're calling this proposed interim arrangement a peace government, which is it's supposed to be eventually replaced by a permanent government after they can hold new elections. But they can't hold new elections until they start messing with the Constitution. So there's like an order that they have to do this in. And before they can get to that, they're going to have to work out some kind of just agreement of who serves in this temporary, interim government, which is likely to be very contentious. Like they're going to have to sit down and actually just like not through any democratic process. They just have to agree on who might get in there. Let's see. For the Afghan legislature, they have a couple options in this draft proposal. Either they're going to retain the current parliament and just add some Taliban guys into it to sort of balance it out, or they suggested outright suspending parliament to, during this interim government transition period and giving all the authorities to the executive, which again I think will be fairly controversial in this. Um, and then the last major thing that I don't think is actually in the draft proposal itself, but I've been seeing a lot of reporting about this, is that they do want to bring in some like foreign and regional powers to take part in these talks, to have like, have it be shorn up by all these regional stakeholders and stuff. And that's including Russia and Iran and Pakistan, I guess, as well as the Turks. And that's actually where I think they want to hold this new round of negotiations, somewhere in Turkey rather than Qatar. So this, I think, could also spell a lot of trouble, like adding in all these new parties to the negotiations, like, could really complicate a lot of things in the talks, create a lot of impasses and stuff. But that is basically what they're proposing here. That's the draft gets a little more detailed, but this is sort of the broad strokes of their supposed peace plan.
So, do they have any idea? And the most obvious problem to me here, Will, is that the last election in Afghanistan was an absolute train wreck. It was what, 6 months after the election that they actually called the results. There were contention all over the place of voter fraud here or there. Ballots were lost. Some precincts weren't even open. I'm pretty sure most of the Taliban areas of Afghanistan, they didn't even have places to vote or anything like that. And so if you can't hold an election, then this whole process is illegitimate, and they've shown no ability to hold a successful election. There's a pretty good recent article by James Bovard that we reprinted at the Libertarian Institute. I'll put the link in the show notes page for anybody who wants to read it. But he goes through and details all the problems with the Afghan elections, from fraud to, and then, after this latest election, they finally certified the thing and claimed that these were the results. And an opposing president just swore himself in on the same day, and then was able to negotiate a deal to, get himself in office in the government, and to have a key position negotiating the agreement with the Taliban. So, that was the first thing that jumped out at me. That I think if you're hinging any future peace in Afghanistan on being able to hold an election that seems legitimate and give actual results that reflect the will of the people, and also have the appearance of legitimacy for the people too, which, maybe things have changed since the first U.S. election in Afghanistan, but I remember from that one, people are kind of asking, what's the point of this? Isn't the current guy in charge until he dies? Like, why are we having another election? So, well, I don't know if you have anything on that, Will, but that was the first thing that jumped out at me. The second problem was obviously having some kind of ceasefire, but I don't know. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, just in terms of like, I have some more stuff on just who's reacting to this and how. And honestly, my first instinct was just that like everyone's going to pretty much reject this. This didn't seem, I figured the Taliban, given that they already inked a deal with the last guy in charge in the U.S., I figured they would not be willing at all to hear this. However, apparently that's not true. I've been reading some reporting that indeed the Taliban is considering this at the very least. The current president Ashraf Ghani, he's kind of signaled that he's not going to be cool with this. He wants to stick to the Afghan constitution as it currently exists. He's against any idea of like setting up an interim government that doesn't involve an election first. I think he's kind of worried that he might get sort of sidelined in this whole process. That he might lose some of his own power. And of course, the Afghan government, as it currently exists, like we should remember, it's a very entrenched. There's a lot of entrenched interests. Like the government pretty much relies and depends on U.S. aid and stuff. And so a lot of officials, I think, when they start seeing that this might end, like the stream of aid and stuff, they get a little nervous. And so Ghani, that could partially explain his reaction. However, I did see a former president of Afghanistan, Hamid Karzai. He gave an interview to the AP, and he seemed way more optimistic. He was saying that like he thinks this is like the best chance for any kind of long-lasting or comprehensive peace. And so I don't know. I think he's supposed to have some role in these talks too. I know that he like frequently advises the Afghanistan envoy Zalmay Khalilzad, and so Karzai seems to be a little bit more on board. And then, like I was saying as well, I saw Tolo News citing a former Pakistan envoy to the Taliban, saying that like this could be something the Taliban accepts, that they're meeting, they're considering it, they haven't just rejected it on their face. And so maybe the Taliban is kind of being a little more realistic here. They're, again, I expected them just to reject this and say, no, we're sticking to the deal. They've said that like they wouldn't accept any foreign forces in the country after May 1st. But I don't know, maybe like they're loosening their position a little bit. They realize maybe Biden's not going to stick to the Trump deal, and so they're just taking what they can get here. I'm not totally sure, but I was a little surprised in how open they seem to the idea.
Right. Yeah, I guess that is a good sign. As you say, there's a lot of factions within the Afghan government, and so, well, the current president, I'm not surprised at all that he doesn't want to give up power because, it's probably his grip on power that allows him to continue to win elections, and so, if you're not the guy in charge when the election's happening, it makes it hard to win that election. So I would guess that there's a lot going on right here, and it's great that it's being considered. And who knows, maybe adding groups like other countries like Russia and Turkey to the talks could help facilitate some communication. Although I'm not sure what the whole feeling of the Russians is in Afghanistan, especially among the Taliban, from the Soviet occupation. Anything else on this agreement, Will? Certainly, if parties start to agree to it and we end up with the interim government in Afghanistan, a ceasefire, that would be fantastic. But and we'll continue to update. But anything else on it?
Yeah, I mean, like I'm sort of cautiously optimistic, just given some of the reactions I've seen so far. Like maybe this has some kind of chance, but I'm also kind of worried that this is just going to be another excuse. Like we've had 2 decades of excuses of staying in this country, of continuing, our military involvement, our occupation, our basically like administering and financing their government. It just seems like this could potentially, be an excuse to stay for much longer. So I'm worried that it will become that. But yeah, I'm cautiously optimistic that maybe this could, jumpstart some talks because we did see like the current Afghan talks in Qatar they haven't been progressing very quickly. I don't know. I haven't been keeping super close tabs on them lately, so maybe there'd been some progress, but I didn't get that impression that they were going anywhere.
No, from the impression that I got, there were a couple things going on. The first was that I think both sides were unsure of what the Biden policy position on Afghanistan would be,
Right.
and that makes a huge difference if you're the Taliban and Biden's like, no matter what happens in Qatar, we're leaving on May 1st. That's a different scenario you're negotiating from than if Biden says that no matter what we're staying past May 1st. And so the continued ambiguity in the Biden policy is probably not making it easy for talks to develop, especially what we're like 6 weeks out now from that May 1st deadline.
Yeah.
The fighting in Afghanistan is continuing to go on. There was a recent car bomb in Afghanistan. Absolute tragedy. 2 kids, 6 civilians in total killed. And that was right outside, I guess, an Afghan government police station. Just from the details of this attack, while the Taliban have not claimed responsibility, this seems to have more Taliban hallmarks than the Islamic State Khorasan group, which sometimes the Taliban get blamed for what they do, but that doesn't seem to be the case here. So very unfortunate of the continued fighting going on in Afghanistan, and well, there's probably nothing Biden could do to prevent violence from happening in Afghanistan, but at least it'd be great if the U.S. wasn't contributing to it. However, it seems the Senator Bob Menendez, he's the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, is absolutely determined to make sure the U.S. is involved in further violence in Afghanistan. This from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. Top Democratic senator questions May 1st Afghan withdrawal deadline. Menendez says Biden might have to reconsider the withdrawal date. He says that the Taliban are clearly not abiding by all their commitments, which may be true. It's pretty vague on how much of the deal that we have seen. There's reported to be secret annexes to it, and so there could be different metrics the Taliban aren't living up to, but they haven't attacked U.S. soldiers. No U.S. soldiers killed in the past year, and that was a major part of the agreement between the U.S. forces and the Taliban. While the U.S. has continued to carry out airstrikes in support of the Afghan government, not necessarily to defend U.S. forces, but still carrying out airstrikes against the Taliban. And so I guess, both sides are probably somewhat in violation of this agreement. So it's rather disturbing that he's trying to say, oh, the Taliban aren't agreeing, so we have to stay. Again, this means more U.S. airstrikes and potentially, more dead U.S. troops. That the Taliban threatened if the U.S. missed that deadline, they're going to ramp up attacks. Now, as you say, they're signaling that they're maybe willing to engage in these talks. Maybe they'll continue to hold off attacking Americans past the May 1st deadline, but it still seems like at some point American troops in the near future will have to leave Afghanistan to prevent the Taliban from directly targeting Americans. Will, anything else on Afghanistan?
No, I think we hit all our bases there.
All right. So we got this Reason article here, Will, and occasionally you would hear somebody say, I've heard people say this, that in the U.S. As a black man, you could be arrested for standing on your own doorstep. And, sometimes when people say that, you think, okay, maybe that's a little extreme. Like, I get, the whole driving while black thing, that's probably true. But just standing on your own doorstep. But some cops definitely proved me wrong that that's not the case. Because here we have a story from Reason. Cops who assaulted and arrested a man for standing outside his own house got qualified immunity. SCOTUS will not hear the case. This man, Chase House, was standing on his front porch, and the Cleveland police, a plainclothes officer approached him and, I guess asked him what he was doing there, and he said he lived there. Now, Will, I mean, if some, plainclothes person just in regular clothes asked me what I was doing while I was about to walk into my own house, I probably wouldn't answer them at all. But apparently this guy answered and, used an expletive in his answer, but it seemed pretty appropriate, to be quite honest. And then the police ended up coming, beating him, and arresting him. And so I believe it was initially the Fifth Circuit Court that granted the police qualified, or the Sixth Circuit Court that initially granted the cops qualified immunity. And with the Supreme Court not taking up the case, it appears that he will that these cops will completely get off. And I think one of the biggest tragedies of the story, well, it sounds like that the man who was beaten on his own front porch will end up with spending more time in jail than the cops who beat him. So we got on this.
Yeah, I mean I think you're right. I think this story is like, it's egregious not only for the police that are involved, but it's also just like shows that the broader criminal justice system and judicial system is designed to protect them and let them off the hook almost no matter what they do, as long as they were on the clock when they did it. Now, fortunately, in this case, this guy House, like, yes, they, showed up to his house, said, "Who are you? What are you doing?" Didn't believe him when he said he lived there, and then basically kicked his ass and arrested him for nothing. And then they charged him as well for resisting in the process of them doing it. And fortunately for this guy, those charges were dropped. I think there was like a obstructing official business and some kind of assault charge that fortunately he did get dropped. However, yeah, as you're saying, first you had a federal court saying that, like, nope, these cops were, they had qualified immunity, they're protected. And now we have the Supreme Court refusing to hear a case where they could have possibly reviewed the entire concept of qualified immunity. And we've covered that in the show a few times, but it's basically qualified immunity is like a legal doctrine that says you have to prove that a cop like knowingly and willfully did something illegal in the course of his job in order to prosecute him, which is usually very difficult to establish. And it also often means that like plaintiffs, they have to point to very hyper specific precedent, like of another case that's identical to theirs where that did result in prosecution of a cop. Otherwise, the courts just kind of take it like, the cop can do whatever he wants as long as he can make up some kind of BS excuse that it, related to, an investigation he was doing or something. They always give them the right of way, basically. They just, assume that they're in the right.
Right. Police could do anything if they see suspicious activity. And the only thing I'd add, Will, is that it applies to all state employees, not just police. So let's say a prosecutor claims that, Will, we have, your fingerprints on the gun that murdered this guy. Sign this confession right here, right now, or else we'll take it to court and put you in the electric chair. And you sign that confession, even if that evidence doesn't exist, the prosecutor won't be, held legally accountable for it because there's not a statute saying specifically you can't threaten
Right.
somebody with murder if they don't confess to a crime they didn't commit. So,
Yeah, I mean, it protects people on many different rungs of the system. It seems like, the system's kind of, it seems to close ranks around its own, usually, whether that's a prosecutor or a cop or a judge or whoever. But yeah, I mean, in this case, according to the US judicial system, the cops can walk up to your house, they can, start a fight with you for no reason whatsoever, beat you up, and then arrest you for, resisting in the process of them beating you up. Fortunately, in this case, the charges against the guy were dropped, but the court system basically affirmed that yes, that the cops can do that to you. They have no, there's no punishment for them. That's part of their job, legitimately, that they can just, walk up to your house and beat you up basically and charge you. It's outrageous, I think.
right. I want so badly, to be the prosecutor there and then slap kidnapping charges on the cops for arresting the guy and putting him in jail. And then also, there really ought to be some kind of crime. If you're a cop that writes unnecessarily charges or writes people tickets and crimes, and then they prove they're innocent, like there should be some kind of repercussion for that. Because we see in so many of these cases where the police illegally detain somebody, but in the course of being illegally detained, you act like a person. Like if a cop is going to arrest you for some reason they shouldn't, like your natural reaction is to stand back, put your hands down, and be like, whoa, man, like listen, like we're not done talking yet, because if we are done talking, you would see you don't need to arrest me. And so often that ends up being turned into a resisting arrest charge, and then rather than the cops actually facing punishment for needlessly arresting somebody, people are just so relieved to have the charges that could be felonies against them dropped after they spend a couple days in jail, that they that kind of resolves the situation. In reality, that doesn't get you anywhere near justice. So,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this House guy, he did try to sue them. He countersued for malicious prosecution, but that was what got thrown out. That was when the federal court decided, nah, these guys had qualified immunity, and you can't get him for that.
Right. It's all unbelievable. Will anything else on the cops getting away with anything they want, including beating innocent people on their doorsteps?
Now, unfortunately, I think this will not be the last time we see a story like this until maybe the Supreme Court does finally, agree to accept a case where they could review something like qualified immunity, because then, we might actually get some, movement on that in a broader sense. But nope, until then, we're probably going to keep seeing this repeat itself.
Right. There's just one more detail of the story I had right now. Apparently, the guy's like mom came out while the cops are beating him. You
Yes,
know
yeah,
what? And even then, they weren't like, oh, sorry, man. Like, if you're saying that this is your son, he was on your doorstep, then, like, let the guy go home. And
right.
even then, they can't let that happen. It just shows, especially with state employees, it seems like once they're wrong and it's exposed, rather than admitting it and moving on, they're solutions just to kind of escalate it and continue to arrest and press charges and stuff. Well, I guess to set up this next one, there's this interesting report at CNN on Yemen. We don't often see uh, reports from CNN or anywhere in the mainstream media on Yemen, and when we do, typically they're not things that I don't know, that seem to be reflective of the situation on the ground, but more U.S. propaganda. I'm gonna go ahead and play a couple minutes of this story, or not a couple minutes, a couple seconds, probably like 30, 45 seconds of the story, Will, and then we could talk a little bit about some of the details here. But CNN really went in on trying to say like, hey, in the next year, there's 400,000 children in Yemen at risk of dying, and it's largely, or at least in part, due to the Saudi and U.S. blockade on Yemen. So I'll go ahead and play that now.
Saudi blockade has allowed tankers packed with the necessary fuel for food and supplies to reach starving Yemenis, to dock at the crucial port of Hadeda, which is controlled by the Houthis. And 14 tankers scheduled to dock there are currently being held off the Saudi coast, according to a vessel tracking app, all which goes against a United Nations agreement. CNN's Nima Elbagir made a very dangerous trip on a small boat to get inside Houthi territory in northern Yemen, a place few foreign journalists have ever been, in order to show the world, in order to show you what it's really like for innocent parents and children. And we want to warn you, some of these images will be tough to watch.
All right. Well, YouTube ad makes a good place to move on. So, yeah, I thought that was just really interesting that CNN is suddenly taking interest, especially now that Biden's president. I think the political interest would typically tell us that it would be maybe Fox News that's now running this kind of stuff to make the Biden administration look bad. But it's CNN that's doing some pretty decent reporting. I guess it would have been nice if he had preference that she would have trouble getting into northern Yemen because the Saudis and the U.S. won't allow flights to the Sana'a airport. But just going into the fact that there's hundreds of thousands of children in the country starving, and there's boats filled with the things they need to not starve sitting off the coast of Yemen, and the Saudis are preventing that from happening. So, well, what was your thought on this report?
Yeah, I mean, especially for CNN, I thought it was pretty good. There were a couple issues with it, I thought, but overall on that, it was not a bad report at all. I mean, occasionally corporate media does cover Yemen, but a lot of the time when they do, they will look at the humanitarian disaster, but a lot of the time they won't mention the role of like foreign powers in supporting it and keeping it going. The U.S. and British support to the Saudi, coalition and their bombing campaign and their blockade. A lot of time that kind of takes a back seat, even though that's kind of the whole reason it's allowed to continue. Is because of that foreign support, and I really can't stand that. However, this CNN piece did do a pretty good job putting up, front and center that the U.S. supports this, that this couldn't happen without, American backing. Jake Tapper is saying that, it started under Obama, it escalated under Trump, which I think is true. Trump did cut off the midair refueling to the Saudis, but that was only after they developed their own capability to do it themselves. So, I think it is fair to say that Trump largely did escalate support to the Saudis. I think sold them more weapons, that kind of stuff. And as people heard in the clips, like in the clip, they do stress the humanitarian situation there, the 400,000 children that the UN is saying are at risk of dying because there's a looming famine there and all these other humanitarian problems. And importantly too, I think this CNN piece actually shows some of the horrifically malnourished and starving children in some of these hospitals, which I think is important to show. It's graphic and it's horrible, but that is the outcome of U.S. policy. That is what it does. So they didn't drive it home super hard that like, oh, this is Uncle Sam thanks to the U.S. Government that you get these starving children. But I think the implication came through pretty well. They put enough focus that it is the U.S. allowing this to happen. They also call attention to the blockade, the 14 fuel ships that are being barred from entering the port of Hodeidah, and the food trucks that aren't being allowed to get in, all that stuff. So they did good, focusing on that. So overall, I thought it was not too bad. There were still a few shortcomings, though. There, like one, did it really take CNN 6 years to notice this? That before their first, I don't know if this is their first substantial piece of reporting on it. I think it is, though. And if that is
I
true,
would say they did that one report on the U.S. made weapons going through the UAE and Saudi to Al Qaeda bat, and then even into the hands of Houthi forces in Yemen.
yeah,
And they did do a also report on the bomb that killed those children being and on the school bus being U.S. made. I think they detailed a little bit more, but less than one a year. The average is like one or two, one every 1 or 2 years.
Right. Okay, you're right. I shouldn't exaggerate. This isn't literally their first ever coverage of it. It's just like, it is a little shameful that in 6 years of this war, we can probably count on one or two hands the number of like, in-depth stories they've even done on it. And I think probably a lot of those previous ones had a lot of the shortcomings that I had mentioned too, about sort of like glossing over the U.S. support and all that stuff. This one, they really is probably their best one yet, of any of their Yemen coverage. But I do wish they would have done more reporting on the role of the U.S. role in the blockade. Like they mentioned that the State Department denied that the port of Hodeidah is even still being barred. But I still wish they would have done a little more like, how is the U.S. supporting this blockade exactly? And of course, we have the same old crap about Iran-backed Houthis that, we can expect in all corporate media coverage of this. They never take the slightest effort to even begin to prove that Iran is supporting this. But that's just sort of the slogan, Iran-backed Houthis. So there were a couple, annoying things about this. But overall, like, the segment was not bad. Right at the end of it, they even say that like, they frame it like, well, Biden claims that he wants to end the war. Like something needs to happen now. And like, they even call on their viewers to like, pressure their representatives to do something. Now that could be interpreted various ways, pressure your representatives to get more involved, to have the U.S. more involved in the conflict, to wind it down, or maybe pressure them to stop U.S. support for the conflict, which is really, as I've been saying, that's really what allows it to continue. So, I would hope that CNN's viewers took that interpretation from that call to action.
Right. I would hope the memorable things, and this is why I think the report's so important, is that I think what's memorable, especially if you saw it, is the story of the children, the 400,000 children, and the food with their supplies being kept off the coast. You know why? Like I feel like that's like why. Now the problem with it is it still has all the other little propaganda details in there that have been used all this time to continue the war. So calling the Houthis Iranian bat rather than being like, the Obama administration said they support the Houthi or support the Saudis against the Houthis to placate them over the Iran nuclear deal, and they don't seem very interested in getting back in the Iran nuclear deal. So why do we have to keep placating the Saudis? Like that would be
Right.
an interesting, thing, or to really point out how Biden could take immediate steps to resolve this situation. I mean, I would assume that, if he told the Saudis, like, hey, I told that that ship with like Red Cross aid on it to dock at the port of Hadeda tomorrow, and if any Saudi military intervenes, we'll make sure that ship gets through. Like, I'm
Right.
pretty sure that's something that could happen. Or if any Saudi military ship intervenes, like all the Patriot missile batteries are leaving Saudi Arabia tomorrow. Goodbye.
Right.
There's real threats that Biden could make that in a lot of ways are also things I would support, like just de escalating and getting out of the Middle East towards Saudi Arabia to make sure that they stop this genocide. Also, do we have any idea, Will, in me and Connor talked about this on the show last week, and just not knowing with the changes in the Biden policy, how in the past we've gotten statements that the U.S. is supporting the what they call rules of navigation that are in the area. So apparently, the Saudi blockade in the Gulf of Aden and in the Red Sea is that still going on? Are the American is like the American military, which there are Navy ships like in the Red Sea and in the area, are they helping to enforce this blockade, or is that like kind of a question mark that it would have been really nice if a media organization with the resources of CNN was able to figure that out for us?
I think the latter. Like that's really what I was hoping the CNN would have done more work on is just like, exactly what are the nuts and bolts of, the continued US support for the blockade. Are they still helping to literally police it with warships, or like what kind of support are we still giving to that? Is it sort of like the Saudis have their own kind of system in place that operates on its own and we just kind of like, make sure nothing, offsets that? I don't know. Like I would have liked CNN to, do a little more in-depth reporting there. They did get a reporter on the ground into Yemen as well. Like she went to various hospitals and stuff and did some pretty decent on the ground, reporting there. But yeah, that would have been one thing I wish they had dug into more.
Right. I feel like there should be a report itself on the small number of reporters that have actually made it into northern Yemen
Yeah,
since this started. And remember, we're talking 6 years. And so I believe like James Ferguson has been there, and Iona Craig
Anna Craig.
and
Yeah,
a couple other Western reporters, but it's not as many as you would think. And especially for the amount of suffering that's going on in that country. They're talking about 400,000 children this year, but it's already happened. You know what I mean? Well, like as terrible as it is, what's going to happen maybe in 2021, and I'm glad people are finally starting to pay attention a little bit. This is something that the entire anti-war community in the U.S. has been screaming about for 6 years. That was already happening, and we now have. The UN food chief, the head of the World Food Program, going to Yemen, and he says this is hell. And I mean, from the CNN video, it seems hard to dispute that. But Will, I know you want to talk about this article a little bit. So what's he saying? How bad is it?
yeah. I mean, like, just I think we basically summarized it. He just all the looming famine, the hundreds of thousands of children that could die here. That yeah, like even the UN's the food chief who I'm sure has seen a lot of like really messed up stuff. He's calling this hell. That's his characterization of this whole thing. Now, fortunately, we do have some reports that the U.S. has signaled that it will soon restart its humanitarian aid program to the Houthi-controlled parts of Yemen, which Trump had canceled fairly barbarically. We were fully supporting the war that's creating this disaster in the first place, and then we're cutting off this very paltry sum of aid we were giving them. like I think it's not the worst thing that we're restarting that. Ideally, I would prefer if we weren't involved in this in any capacity. But if we're going to be backing this war and this brutality against millions and millions of people, putting them in this situation, then relieving that suffering a little bit is probably a good thing. I hope that that does actually end up helping some people and not just get stolen or something. I know a lot of there's a lot of politics around aid and stuff that gets pretty cynical and unfortunate on the ground there. But I would hope that actually helps people.
Well, one of the crazy things here is that if it was a natural disaster that happened, aid would be pouring in. I remember, and I'm sure you do, when we were younger and the tsunami hit Indonesia and, a few 100,000 people died.
Yeah.
And everybody was talking about for a very long time, and everybody was fundraising and pouring in aid. Or, again, COVID is a natural thing that, it's very unfortunate that people are dying from the virus and everything. But at the same time, like, viruses have killed people for as long as people have been alive, right? Now, this situation in Yemen, as the World Food Program says, it's the worst place on earth, and it's entirely man-made. That's the part that makes it so hard to get over for me. Will is that it doesn't have to be that way, this way at all, and there's so many different ways that it could have not been this way. Like Saudi Arabia not targeting the civilian and the food infrastructure of Yemen, like allowing the ships to dock at the port of Hadada, like not the Saudi Arabia bombed the permanent construction, the permanent cranes to offload the shipping containers at the port of Hadada. For anybody who's ever seen a dock, you need these massive cranes to quickly unload the ships. If you don't have it, they finally got the mobile cranes to Yemen after those were forced to like sit off the coast of Yemen for a couple of years, but they don't unload stuff nearly as fast as the permanent cranes would. Like, there's just so many things that could have happened in this war, specifically that could come from pressure by the U.S., whether it was Obama, Trump, or now Biden, or just the Saudis not being complete genocidal maniacs towards the Yemenis. It doesn't have to be that way, and yet it is this way because of, in large part, choices made by the U.S. government and then the government of Saudi Arabia and the UAE.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it, I mean, for something like this to happen, it requires so much complicity. So many people have to cooperate and take part in this. And there's a lot of I mean, we did see even some of the dock workers in Europe refusing to load some of these ships and stuff. That was a very commendable effort. But it's crazy how many points at which this could be stopped, and then it doesn't. It continues on for years and years. That all this complicity.
Right. And just to clarify what Will said, when you say these ships, weapon ships that were bringing weapons to Saudi Arabia, not the aid ships.
Yeah, my bad.
Was, for anybody who didn't listen to my interview with Matteo, where, he's in the UK and from Italy, and he talked about movements in those two countries to try to block those things from happening. Well, anything else on Yemen before we move on here to talk about some sanctions?
I would encourage people watch the CNN segment. I think it's 10, 12 minutes long or something. I think that's the only time I'd ever encourage people. Yeah, definitely watch CNN on the show. But I mean, hey, credit where due. They did a decent report. They got actual journalists into Yemen, so watch it. I would say.
So, Will, before we start talking about sanctions here, I just want to say there's two great recent pieces on sanctions. One's by Brian McGlinchey, who was the 28 Pages guy. Now, great. I forget what his Substack is now called, but he has a recent piece on sanctions saying that the U.S. sanctions regime is the moral equivalent to Osama bin Laden's war on terror, and he goes into that, and that's fantastic. And then Sheldon Richman has a new piece that's out at the Libertarian Institute, reprinted on antiwar.com, titled, I believe, Unbelievably Sadistic, and he goes into the U.S. foreign policy, but particularly the sanctions. And so if people want, just really well-written discussions on sanctions and how horrible and immoral they are, I refer you to those two articles. I'll put the links in the show notes page. But Will, let's get into this story here, where some countries are starting to push back against U.S. sanctions. This is from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com, who also happened to be the last guest on this show, titled 16 Countries Push Back Against U.S. Sanctions at UN. Will, what's going on here?
Yeah. So I don't have a ton of detail on this story, but I think it is at least worth mentioning that, these 16 countries, as well as the Palestinians, have come together at the UN to protest the constant use of unilateral sanctions by the US. I believe all the countries in this group are themselves sanctioned by the US. But if that's not the case, it's definitely most of them that are, directly facing U.S. sanctions. And they wrote this joint letter denouncing the use of sanctions and saying that they basically violate the UN Charter. And as you might expect, the countries in this are the ones that are heavily sanctioned: China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, Syria, Venezuela, Cuba, a bunch of other ones, including the Palestinians, who they're not technically a nation state, but nonetheless suffer under American penalties and under various forms. And I'm not even sure what effect this letter will have. It very well could just be a symbolic gesture from these countries, but they are now banding together on some level and pushing back, which I think is interesting to see. And then, in the case of Venezuela, just this week we had a senior Biden official basically admitting that U.S. sanctions over the last 4 years had utterly failed to oust Nicolas Maduro, the president of Venezuela, from power, which is a very telling admission, given that that's the entire point of these sanctions. And this was announced when the Biden administration, he declared he was going to give some immigration protections to Venezuelans who had fled to the U.S. And in that announcement, the official basically admitted that, yeah, the sanctions don't really work. You were talking recently on the show about this book written by Biden's Iran envoy, Richard Nephew, where he's saying that like the purpose of sanctions is to hurt the poor so that they'll rise up against the evil regime and all this stuff. But that second part never seems to happen. We crush these poor people, and oftentimes in third world countries. We devastate their local economy, and then they don't rise up and overthrow their leader, just like happened in Venezuela here, just like they're admitting happened. And recently, we actually had a UN special reporter go there and publish this report, finding that American sanctions on Venezuela are fueling what she called humanitarian calamities, that they're depriving people of food, fuel, medicine, water, electricity, everything that goes into modern civilized life. We'd also previously had a study in 2019 by the Center for Economic Policy Research that suggested that the sanctions may have contributed to up to 40,000 excess deaths in Venezuela. And those things are hard to quantify, but that is sort of like, that's the number they came up with. So sanctions certainly work to grind people into misery and poverty. Yet even Biden's own people are now admitting that this has all been completely pointless in the case of Venezuela and accomplished none of their goals. And I think you could say the same for the entire theory of sanctions. Like the same thing is true about Iran, that this has not helped to, the people have not, risen up to overthrow the Ayatollah. The sanctions are supposed to have these outcomes, but they just don't. These are just attacks on civilian populations, plain and simple. And that's really all they accomplish.
Right. Well, and it's hard to find an example, Will, where I guess people maybe point to South Africa, but where the leader actually doesn't end up more empowered. If you look at North Korea, there's no indication, despite the near complete world isolation in that country, that the sanctions are hurting his ability to rule. And in fact, there's a lot of evidence that he uses as propaganda to, say that the reason your life sucks isn't because of me, it's because of the sanctions. I think the same thing with Maduro. In Richard Nephew's book, he openly admits that the sanctions were used not only to further impoverish the regular citizens, but also to enrich the elites, which would seem to increase their hold on power. And, I had talked in the past on the show about how a lot of times when you sanction a country, it's the government officials that are best in position to engage in smuggling, and so it actually tends to benefit the people who are well connected to the state. And I thought that this was just one of those unintended consequences of U.S. foreign policy, and that the think tankers were just too stupid to see it. But no, apparently that's the actual game to empower the government. It's absolutely backwards. I think the fourth title of my foreign policy focused podcast, Will, was "Sanctions Are Stupid and Don't Work." And in there, one of the things I talked about was that the more the U.S. uses sanctions, and I saw this coming under the Trump administration where they're just sanctioning everybody, the more that the sanctioned countries are going to band together. And I obviously we're seeing that more here, and my guess is that eventually they're going to just maybe not go through the UN and set up their own thing, their own exchange systems and stuff like that to better do business and trade. Right now, like Venezuela is having to smuggle their gold apparently to the UAE through Mali. Do you think that hurt? The government officials are all getting their cuts still. Will, I'm sure. Maybe they're not making as much as they would if they sold normally, but they're probably all still getting their cuts, right? It's the people of Venezuela that aren't getting their cut when the all the transactions have to happen so black market like this. So it's
Yeah,
very unfortunate what's happening here.
that's right, and it's very odd. It seems like it's kind of like you said, it's driving all these countries to band together, and the U.S. is trying to pursue this crazy unipolar strategy where it's the dominant superpower in the world and it controls all the institutions. But in doing this, in sanctioning all these countries, it is driving a multipolar world. That sooner or later, these other countries are going to create their own SWIFT. They're going to create their own, financial institutions, and there won't be this like single lever of power the U.S. can just, hit it like a switch, like they kind of can with SWIFT right now. They can just threaten and all these countries with secondary sanctions and make nobody trade with Iran or whatever the target nation is. But it seems like it's sort of having this opposite effect. It's driving, the creation of these new poles of power where, these regional countries are all banding together. So very interesting, outcome.
And then these same people their colleagues at their think tanks will go, oh my God, China is getting so much more powerful and has so much more influence. We have to spend a ton of money combating China. We have to build military. We have to, finance different loans and stuff because
missile networks and the first island chain.
Well, I'm talking about like competing with them in Belt and Road. Like, oh no, China has a port in Somalia finance. We have to now finance 5 ports or something. Like, it's just absolutely crazy. All the different things that happen, and all because we're sanctioning countries that we really don't have any business with anyways. We're preventing other countries from doing. It's not like we're telling Apple not to sell an iPod to Bashar al-Assad. We're saying that the Iranians can't give fuel to the Syrians, and so they're freezing to death in their homes, and they're unable to have the food and fuel and everything they need. Did you also read, just by the way, the Wall Street Journal recently reported that Israel claims to have attacked 12 ships since 2019 that were attempting to bring goods into Syria?
I didn't see that.
Yeah,
Wow.
for all the complaining that's gone on about how Iran's such a destabilizing power attacking all these ships, apparently it's been happening quite a bit from a U.S. ally, and nobody's been saying anything. Will, anything we didn't get to so far on the show, or does that pretty much cover what we had today?
Yeah, we think we ran down all the stuff we intended to talk about.
All
That is
right.
funny though. The Israelis just like a week ago were saying how the Iranians attacked a ship, and they're just accusing them of that. That's funny. I'll have to go read that journal piece.
Yeah, I think there's a riot on at antiwar.com too. Will, great to have you back, and we'll do another one soon. Tell people where to find your work.
Sure. Easiest way to find the stuff that I write, I put it out on my Twitter page. So just find me at the Will Porter on Twitter, and that should be one-stop shop for all my stuff.
All right, and then follow the show on Twitter at con_interest. I'm on Twitter at Kyle Anslone_. The Facebook page is booming. Make sure you check it out. Conflicts of interest. Facebook still won't allow us to invite our friends to like the page. They even actually suggest sometimes that I should invite my friends to like the page, and then don't provide me with the ability to do that. So that's pretty frustrating. And then they will put a nice little ad in my feed saying that if I want 350 people to see my page of my 2,000 friends, I could pay Facebook $10 to do that. So if you want to help take some profits away from Mark Zuckerberg, like the page so we could do it for free, and then make sure you like and share the content to put it out there to people, because if we don't have people hitting the share button, other people don't see it. So really appreciate for everybody who's supporting the show, and we'll be back with another one on Wednesday. Thanks, Will.
See you, Kyle. Bye, everybody.